If there was one promise that Donald Trump repeated more than any during his campaign for president, it was probably this.
Immediately upon taking the oath of office, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history. We'll get them out.
It was a promise he said he'd start carrying out on day one.
We will seal the border. We will stop the invasion, and we will begin the largest deportation of criminals, the criminal element, which is
Now Trump is president-elect. And on Monday, he confirmed on social media he wants to use the military for mass deportations. Trump's also been busy picking allies to serve in his administration. People like Stephen Miller as his deputy chief of staff, and Tom Homan as his so-called border czar. These names might sound familiar to you if you followed the last Trump administration. Their talking points are familiar too.
I got a message.
Here's Tom Homan speaking at the Republican National Convention in July.
As a guy who spent 34 years deporting illegal aliens, I got a message to the millions of illegal aliens that Joe Biden's releasing our country in violation of federal law. You better start packing now.
The thing is, the last time Homan, Miller, and Trump worked together, they couldn't get it done.
Some of this feels a little bit like Groundhog Day because the first time Trump took office, he also promised millions of deportations.
Nick Miroff covers immigration enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security for The Post.
He had Tom Homan running immigration and customs enforcement as aggressively as possible, and they really ratcheted up arrests and deportations, but they never got to more than a few 100,000 per year, and it fell far short of the expectations that Trump had set. This time around, I think there are some key differences. The big ones are that they are going to have Republican control of Congress. They have a majority of the Supreme Court justices, and there is very much a sense that public opinion is on their side in favor of a mass deportation policy. And while I think that they'll be able to significantly increase the number of people who they do arrest and send out, they're still going to really struggle to meet the kinds of superlative expectations that Trump has set for, millions of people going out of the country.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Monday, November 18th. Today, Trump wants to deport millions of people. Nick breaks down the roadblocks his plan could hit, but also why this time around, Trump could have an easier time making his rhetoric a reality. So, Nick, before we get into exactly what Trump could do, I first want to understand more about the current state of immigration in the United States. And first, I want to start at the U.S.-Mexico border. That is a place that gets a lot of attention. What is the current situation at the southern border?
I think anyone who's just been listening to the campaign rhetoric, especially from Trump, would assume that the border is out of control and that things are very chaotic. And, what happened was when Biden came into office, he reversed a lot of Trump's policies. And because of that and various other factors, border crossings really exploded.
Dramatic new images from migrant facilities on the U.S.-Mexico border have emerged today. That comes as the Biden administration dispatches top officials to address the sharp increase in migrants seeking asylum.
And the first 3 years of the Biden administration, we had record numbers of illegal crossings. There was constant chaos there. There were migrants coming into U.S. cities, overwhelming hotels, things like that. A lot of the things that our readers and listeners are familiar with at this point.
About 40,000 asylum seekers have been bused to Denver, Colorado over the last year. That's more per capita than anywhere in the nation. The city is spending millions of dollars every week to house.
This motel is closed, but it is full of people. And residents tell me that there's sometimes 8 people per room, sometimes a dozen. And during the busiest times, more than 25 people per room.
However, in the past, year or so, after things really kind of hit rock bottom for the Biden administration at the border, They have carried out a pretty substantial crackdown, both with the help of the Mexican government, which has really tightened enforcement against, migrants heading north to the U.S. border. But then also they have implemented restrictions on asylum access for people who cross illegally. And so as a result, this year, illegal crossings at the Mexico border are down nearly 80%. And right now are at a point that's even lower than when Trump was in office at the end of his first term.
Oh, wow. And what about the rest of the United States, the undocumented immigrants within the United States? First of all, do we know how many there are?
I mean, the estimate that has been thrown around for many years is about 11 million. I think the thinking is that it's now a little higher, maybe 12 million. Nobody has a great handle on it. And, Trump on the campaign trail threw out all kinds of wild numbers exceeding 20 million or so. But, I think the best guesses are that it's around 11 to 12 million.
And what can we say about the undocumented immigrants throughout the United States? Like, Nick, what is the mix of people we're talking about? How long have they been here, or where did they come from?
Well, we know that the majority are from Mexico. There are significant numbers from Central America. And of course, over the last few years, there have been people coming from all over the world in unprecedented numbers. And so there are newer migrants that have come from other countries. We know that there's about 1 million of them who have already received final deportation orders from a U.S. court. So they have had due process, so to speak. And then there are several million that are, in the shadows that maybe were never detected when they came in. They're working here somewhere, and they have not come into contact with U.S. immigration enforcement.
And what can we say about the reasons people have come here? Like, what is driving people to come here?
Oh, well, it's a, wide range of reasons. I think,
Right.
The big one is obviously for better opportunities. Undocumented workers, as our listeners know, make up a huge part of the American workforce. They're overrepresented in certain fields like agriculture and, food service and meat packing and things like that. But then, of course, there are also people who have come here seeking safety or freedom from some kind of persecution. So it's a wide range of things. And I should also say, others come to follow loved ones and family members who have come before them. And that's a very common phenomenon.
So Trump has been president before. What policies did he put into place during his first term to try to remove people or even keep them from coming to the United States in the first place?
I mean, there was the Remain in Mexico policy that required asylum seekers who crossed the border to go back to Mexico and wait outside the United States while their claims were being adjudicated in U.S. courts.
Today, the migrant protection protocols known as Remain in Mexico will take effect.
All asylum seekers are now required to remain in Mexico to await their day in U.S. immigration court.
And 51,000 have been sent back into Mexico under this policy.
He had asylum cooperation agreements that allowed the U.S. to send asylum seekers back to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to apply for protection in those countries. He also tried to do various asylum bans that would have just barred people from qualifying for any kind of protection if they crossed the border illegally.
So we heard at the beginning of this episode that Tom Homan is one of Trump's picks to lead his immigration efforts, the so-called border czar. I want to hear more about him and also the other key people Trump has suggested he would pick or has already picked to oversee immigration policy in his second term.
Well, the two key figures in the incoming administration are Stephen Miller, who is going to be a deputy chief of staff and really the lead policy advisor on immigration, and Homan, who's the former acting director of ICE, who Trump has appointed to be in a kind of border czar role, overseeing the mass deportation effort that Trump has promised, along with the expected crackdown at the southern border. They know Trump very well, and those two figures really symbolize the kind of aggressive approach that Trump wants to take at the border. And they're very experienced, and they have been preparing for this moment for a decade.
Yeah, I actually want to learn a little bit more about them. I think Stephen Miller is a name that is not unfamiliar to people who, watch the news or listen to the news or paid attention to the first Trump administration. What has Stephen Miller said, or what should we know about him that would tell us how Trump is going to handle deportations this time around?
Yes, Stephen Miller, joined Trump early on during his first campaign and became one of his most trusted aides and his main speechwriter. He has given Trump a lot of the language and a lot of the ideas for Trump's MAGA movement. And the big one is to be very aggressive towards immigrants and to carry out this kind of huge deportation operation.
You have your safe third agreements, you have remain in Mexico, finish the wall, you have robust prosecutions of illegal aliens, you do interior repatriation flights to Mexico and not back.
We can expect Miller will remain an ideological influence and presence in this White House, who will be, pushing for the most aggressive deportation and enforcement policies possible, as well as coming up with some of the more esoteric and creative ways to wield executive power to this end. Both Miller and Homan were some of the key architects of the zero-tolerance family separation policy of Trump's first term that many listeners will remember. And while there are some legal barriers to bringing back a policy of that kind, Trump nor either of these two figures have categorically ruled out bringing back a policy that would separate children from their parents along the border. And, I think it also goes without saying that if you carry out a mass deportation campaign of the kind that Trump has promised, that will involve separating families where one parent is undocumented or has no legal status in the United States.
What else should we know about Homan? Can you tell me a little bit more about him?
Homan was ICE acting director for the first 18 months of Trump's first term, and then he resigned when the White House really didn't advance his confirmation in the Senate. And then he went over to Fox News and has been a commentator since then. And, he represents the sort of unapologetic, tough-talking border cop that I think, Trump has always envisioned for this type of role.
I saw today numerous governors from sanctuary states saying they're going to step in the way. They better get the hell out of the way. Either you help us or get the hell out of the way, because ICE is going to do their job. We're going to take the handcuffs off ICE that the Biden administration put on them and let ICE what they do best.
And now he'll be going into the White House, where he's going to be not only in charge of overseeing the agencies at the Department of Homeland Security that are going to carry this out, but he's going to be able to coordinate among other federal agencies like the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense, which in theory will be able to support this effort.
After the break, we talk about the nuts and bolts of Trump's deportation plan and the pushback already mounting against it. We'll be right back. Okay, Nick, so all of these people have said different things and we could look at their histories as to what they've pushed through before. I'm wondering right now, what are these actual plans? Like, what is our best understanding of what this administration is going to attempt to do with deportations?
Well, it's interesting because I think in his public statements in the last few days, what we've seen from Homan is an effort to try to reset expectations perhaps a bit lower. He has said that the incoming administration is going to prioritize public safety and national security threats. And he was recently asked about this on 60 Minutes by journalist Cecilia Vega before the election.
Can you just limit it to criminals and national security threat, though?
If I'm in charge of this, my priorities are public safety threats and national security threats first.
First implies others follow, though, right?
Absolutely.
Both Trump and Stephen Miller talked about using the National Guard troops to support the mass deportation effort. Miller, in an interview back in February at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, even talked about setting up camps where people would be held before they could be taken out of the country.
Illegal immigrants, and then you move them to the staging grounds, and that's where the planes are waiting for federal law enforcement to then move those illegals home. You deputize the National Guard to carry out immigration enforcement, and then you also deploy the military to the southern border, not just...
Homan, in the last few days, hasn't said any of that and has spoken of a military role only in terms of kind of support functions, providing transportation that would be able to, help ICE. But he's been very clear that he envisions this being led by ICE agents and by the agency. He has spoken of work site enforcement again.
Which would be what, like raids of workplaces, that sort of thing?
Yeah, going to meat packing plants or going to, landscaping, I guess, places where they would expect to find or have, intelligence on a certain number of undocumented employees. But, it has to be pointed out that those operations are logistically complicated. They require a lot of personnel, a lot of planning, and it isn't as if they have the people to just go out and do, 100 of those simultaneously a week.
Yeah. Nick, tell me a little bit more about that, about how realistic some of these possibilities could be. First of all, are there even enough resources and enough infrastructure to, adding detention space or having camps or doing all these raids or having people in the interior of the United States? Like, who are the law enforcement or who are the agencies or who are the people who would be doing this?
Yeah, well, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is the agency that is tasked with carrying this kind of thing out, is about the same size it was when Trump was in office the first time. I mean, there are only about 6,000 ICE agents available to participate in these types of operations. Mm-hmm. And it simply isn't realistic for them to just go out with the personnel and the resources that they have and round up thousands and thousands of people off the streets. Those operations take a lot of planning. There's a lot of security preparation that goes into them, and they're very costly.
And what about the courts? Could there be legal challenges that would block mass deportations?
Yeah, I mean, there will be, I think we can expect immigration attorneys and advocates will be mobilized again to try to resist some of these efforts. And so, even when they do go in and make a bunch of arrests, they don't necessarily translate immediately to deportations. My colleagues actually spoke with an immigration lawyer named Luis Cortez Romero, and he told them that he's been telling clients to have a safety plan in case they get detained.
For example, to make sure that there's somebody who may be able to post their bond if they are to be detained so that they can be released and don't have to spend their entire process in a detention center, to make sure that they have contacts of who they can check in with in the event that a deportation process has started, to know what legal resources are out there, and most importantly, to make sure that they're knowledgeable about all the legal avenues that they have from the beginning, so that if and when a deportation process starts, it's less of a reactionary movement. Because I think that's one of the most traumatic things about deportation and a deportation process, is that it happens so abruptly that individuals usually faced in that situation are in a reactionary fight or flight mode.
Now, the Trump administration, and particularly Stephen Miller, have talked about dusting off some of these extraordinary authorities that were crafted, 200 years ago to deal with foreign enemies and, insurrectionists and things like that would give the executive branch really extraordinary power to just send people out of the country. But I think those two are going to face court challenges.
Mm-hmm. So, Nick, you already touched on this a little bit, but I want to learn more about which immigrants would be most vulnerable or perhaps among the first targeted under these deportation plans.
Yeah, well, so we've talked about 11 to 12 million potential, undocumented immigrants in the United States who would, in theory, would be potential deportees. So there are about 1 million people who have received final removal orders from an immigration court. That means that they basically had due process, and for one reason or another, maybe they didn't show up for their hearings. Maybe they actually went before an immigration judge and were denied, forms of relief, including, asylum, things like that. So those people would be in theory, the easiest to deport from the United States.
And what about immigrants who previously had some kind of protection under the Biden administration or previously? People who were considered undocumented but received some sort of temporary status or protection that allowed them to be here at least temporarily legally.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden administration really increased the universe of people with what is known as temporary protected status, and that's like a provisional status granted to people because the conditions in their country make it unsafe or impractical to send them back to their home countries. And so I think, Trump has already said that he's not going to renew temporary protected status for a lot of the groups who have received it.
Mm-hmm. And what about people who came here illegally as children? Are they vulnerable in this moment right now?
I mean, I think they are. I mean, the Obama administration created the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, specifically for this population of people who were brought here as children by their parents. And it offered them some form of, temporary relief protection in the United States. Their status, has remained really unresolved. Since then, Trump talked about ending that program, and now a federal judge has said that the program was unlawful. And while the government has allowed people to continue to, renew their status, it certainly isn't giving it to anybody else. And there's about 500,000 people in the United States with this status. That includes the immigration lawyer we spoke to, Luis Cortez Romero.
I worry about whether my clients are going to get deported and me with them and what that would look like.
And if it's ended, I think they will join this large pool of people who are going to be vulnerable in the new Trump administration. And there have been record numbers of unaccompanied minors who have crossed the border, either sent by their parents or to rejoin, their parents who are already here. Hundreds of thousands have come in the last few years. And they, too, are going to be in a tenuous situation going forward.
Nick, I'm also thinking about the other side of this equation. And, people who are deported are sent to other countries. So how are these countries preparing or even responding to these plans?
I mean, we haven't seen countries react specifically to Trump's win, but I think it's safe to say that none of the countries, for example, in this hemisphere, who have a potentially large pool of deportees, including Mexico, are prepared for the kinds of things that, Trump is talking about. And so Mexico, for example, would be the recipient not only of large numbers of its own citizens, but potentially Central Americans and people from other countries who have been sent back across the border in large numbers really since Trump's first term. And so there isn't the kind of, shelter networks or other facilities on the other side of the border to receive them. And Mexico is going to face a lot of pressure from Trump if it tries to slow the scale of his deportation ambitions. The first time Trump was in power, he used the threat of severe tariffs to get Mexico to take back more people, and namely under that Remain in Mexico program. And I think we can expect he will use that same playbook.
I guess just looking ahead, Nick, how are opponents of these plans preparing for this new Trump administration? I'm thinking about, immigration advocates and lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, the statements we've seen over the past several days from immigration advocates and lawyers are that they're gearing up and that they're going to be ready and that they're not going to give up. But, I also wonder if there's some exhaustion among donors and among, the people who have supported these efforts the last time. The first time Trump tried to do these things years ago, it was, I think, something kind of new, and people really mobilized, going to the airports after the so-called Muslim ban and so forth. This time I think there will be those efforts, but there seems to be more of a weariness about it. And I think there's also a frustration with the way that things went during the Biden administration when we saw public opinion really flip from people being generally favorable toward immigrants and immigration to, majority support for mass deportation, the kind of mass deportation that Trump is talking about doing.
Well, Nick, thanks so much for taking time to join us.
My pleasure.
Nick Miroff covers immigration enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security for The Post. On Monday, the ACLU sued U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, saying it has failed to provide basic information about how it would carry out a mass deportation. Advocates for immigrants have accused ICE and its contractors of treating migrants harshly and holding them in inhumane conditions. The Post is reporting on so many other stories today. So before we go, here are a couple more we wanted to share with you. First, we have a big update on the war in Ukraine. Ukraine will be able to use American long-range weapons to carry out limited strikes inside Russia for the first time. The Post reported over the weekend that President Joe Biden authorized the use of the weapons, according to 2 senior U.S. officials. It's a significant reversal in U.S. policy toward the war. This news came as 10,000 North Korean troops were sent to Kursk, a region of Russia that's along Ukraine's northern border. The troops are meant to help Russia retake territory gained by Ukraine. U.S. officials told The Post that the Biden administration is worried that North Korea will send more troops to the region. The White House hopes more powerful weapons will put Ukraine in the best possible place ahead of peace talks that Trump is expected to spearhead once he takes office. Russian officials furiously condemned the Biden administration's decision on Monday. A spokesman for Russian President Vladimir Putin said this added, quote, fuel to the fire in the region. And here in the U.S., carrots are being recalled over an E. coli outbreak. At least 1 person has died from the bacteria, and 15 have been hospitalized. That's according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The E. coli outbreak is linked to organic carrots and baby carrots from one supplier, but sold under a bunch of different brand names. That includes Wegmans, Trader Joe's, and Nature's Promise. Stores are not selling the affected products anymore, but the CDC said they may still be in your home, so you'll want to check your fridge. A full list of the affected products is on WashingtonPost.com. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Rennie Stronovsky and Laura Benshoff, with help from Ariel Plotnick. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Monica Campbell with help from Lucy Perkins. Thanks to Maria Sacchetti and Efrain Hernandez Jr. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.